My name is Kijate Alexandra Veyechezo. Can you all hear me correctly because I changed my mic? Okay, I see some heads nodding. Great. Okay. So I was born in Val d'Or in Abitibi in Quebec. My mother is non-Indigenous and my father is Indigenous. I'm from the Anishinaabe Nation. My family is from the Lac Simon community, and I've been raised outside of my community, so that's why I say it like that. But I still feel that it is my community, and it's the doors are still open for me to go back, and I wish one day I'll be able to do so. But right now I've been living in Montreal for 12 years and I'm doing a bachelor's degree in journalism at UQAM. I just started, so it's already been a month, a little bit more than a month, and it's really great for me because I never, and this is Crystal. She's gonna help me animate the panel too. At least I think she will, but usually she just likes to act cute. Anyway, and I don't know, I got distracted again, so that's how she helps me. So I was raised outside of my culture, so I wanted to reclaim my culture, and I started 3 years ago, around 3 years ago, with Wapikoni. I started doing some short films, also connecting with the community and seeing the values that connects us, especially around climate, around the environment, the nature, and how we need to protect it because it is a future. It's for the future generations, 100 generations before. It's the land we are on right now. It's not, anyway, we'll have time to talk about it later. And yeah, I've been doing a lot of public speaking, talking about Indigenous realities, also raising awareness in workshops. And right now I'm doing columns at Espace Autochtone Radio-Canada. I'm just sharing my perspective on different Indigenous realities. And I'm here to animate this panel today. I'm really honored to have been invited to do this with two great people that I can't wait to get to know, because we're here in Quebec and we are like, sometimes when we're stuck in the same place, it's nice to see what's going on in Canada, in the land so-called Canada. So yeah, it's a long intro, but this is me. I'm really glad to see you all. It's really nice that you're all here. And I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with JD, if you're okay with that. And I think you're muted.
There we go. Hi, my name is JD. I use she and her pronouns. I identify as queer or two-spirit interchangeably, but I'm not too picky about that. I currently live in Hamilton, Ontario. I've lived here for about 10 years. My dad's side of the family is Métis Cree, or Métis and Cree, and they live and have lived anywhere between the Saskatchewan and the Red Rivers, out in the prairies. My mom is a white lady from BC. Yeah, I definitely grew up knowing who I was. It was very important to my grandfather. But actually spent very much time in Saskatchewan or even in Canada. I actually grew up overseas. My dad just got a job and moved us really far away. And so when I came back, it took me a while as a teenager to really figure out what being Indigenous meant in an actual Canadian context. But as of right now, I live pretty far away from my family. I live pretty far away from any sort of claim to the land that my ancestors would have. So I am an urban Indigenous person. I exist on territories that aren't mine, that I don't have a claim to. I have a lot to say, and I'm not going to get into it now, about Métis claim to territory, specifically Métis, I would say, like past the Manitoba border and further east, or into British Columbia. I think there's a lot that we need to criticize and really be like skeptical of claim there. So I'm a Métis person that lives in Ontario, but I don't pretend to have any claim to these territories here. And yeah, for the last 10 years, I've been involved in a lot of different organizing. I identify as an anarchist, and I do a lot of organizing in the city, even just against gentrification or, you know, in support of unhoused people. But I primarily, my heart lies with doing Indigenous sovereignty work, with doing anti-extractive work and land defense work. So that's been primarily the focus of a lot of my efforts over the years, including against like the Line 9 pipeline here, both like with the like more like independent or like settler direct action campaigns that happen, and also supporting Chippewa the Thames First Nation with their Supreme Court challenge. I have like a lot of friends and comrades at Six Nations, and I've supported them through their land defense struggles. I have pretty like deep and meaningful connections here with certain ceremony communities, including in Chippewa the Thames, that mean a lot to me. And yeah, over the years, I've done like a fair bit of writing, usually like against reconciliation, or against kind of state pro-state politics. And maybe that's all I'll say about myself. It's like kind of a just an idea of like where I'm speaking from.
Thank you, Miigwech Jaylene. So we can listen to Sockage. Is that how it's pronounced?
Yes, that's correct.
Great. Okay.
All right,
Thank
there we
you.
go. All right. So my name is Sockage. I'm Mi'kmaq, from Mi'kmaq. That's our homeland. My community is Esconobidich. I guess a little bit about my background. I'll begin with the idea that I've served in two militaries. I was first with the Canadian military and then later went to the American. After leaving the militaries, though, I kind of inadvertently started my road of decolonization and started reconnecting with my Indigenous identity and with my community and with my nation. And that kind of led me to where I am today, right? So in that journey, I managed to pick up a bachelor's degree in political science, specialization in international relations, Master of Arts degree in Indigenous governance. I've been involved in Indigenous resistance for 28 years now, in particular working with Indigenous warrior societies. And that's taken me all over North and Central America, helping out wherever I could when there was Indigenous resistance that were calling out for some type of help for people.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Yes, thank you so much for your introductions. For the rest of our discussion, it will be divided in 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about like understanding climate justice through a decolonial lens. And then we're going to talk about where and how allyship can fail. And then I'm going to talk about what real allyship looks like. So how we can work towards real decolonial climate action. And then we'll have some time for questions. So just to give an idea, if everybody's ready, are you ready to start with a question? Sorry, I just need to put you on gallery mode because I can't see JD anymore because there's a lot of you. Okay, great. So the first question, I guess how we're gonna work, I'm just gonna ask questions and then I'll let one of you answer how they feel. Is that okay with you both?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, great. So the first one, I'm gonna read it because those are really great questions. I didn't write them, but those are really great questions. So the first one is building a decolonial climate movement requires that we really understand the deep connections between ongoing colonialism in Canada and the climate crisis. So can you talk a bit about the connections you see between colonialism and climate change in Canada and also globally?
Would you like to go first, Jadian?
Oh, you kick it off.
I purposely asked it. I probably have a long answer. I suspect you will too, because they are great questions, and I really think these are things we can spend a lot of time talking about this issue. So I think in the interest of understanding that there should be a sense of urgency around climate crisis right now. The way I'll respond is I'm going to say straightforward and somewhat blunt. And I realize I'm probably, preaching to the choir here with our listeners, but imagine my responses are really to general mainstream Canadians, right? And that's kind of the approach I'll take to this, right? So I'll start with this question, or I'll provide this answer in a sense that I think really what we need to do in terms of making those connections between colonialism and climate crisis is first understanding the scope of the problem, the crisis itself. Because once we understand how wide that is and how much it encompasses, then we could start to see those connections. So let me give you an example. I suspect the average Canadian sees climate crisis as more of an environmental and maybe an economic problem as they slowly start to factor in capitalism and industrial society, right? And that's probably the mainstream thought as to what is, generating the real problem behind climate crisis. But let me add a wider perspective. I would also say that it is a political problem as well as economic. It's a social, psychological problem. It is a religious, spiritual problem, and a historical problem. So I'm going to just speak to each one of those a little bit. Now, it's a political problem in the sense that when Europeans came over, they came over with the intent to take our lands. That's what colonialism is all about, to take our lands and resources, to usurp our governing power, our authority, to take that from our people, right? And that's the intent of colonialism to begin with. That's the practice of it, right? And in doing so, it's a recognition that indigenous mindset, indigenous culture, indigenous worldview is a problem for colonialism, because we have an idea of being connected and having a sacred responsibility to the land. So when colonialism comes in, it's about becoming an extractive kind of resource system. It's all about taking the land so you can generate all kinds of wealth by transforming those resources into some kind of wealth, right? So politically, Europeans had to remove legitimate, traditional indigenous leaders, and not just the leaders, but the entire government, the ways of governance. They had to remove that because that's a real stumbling block. It's a real barrier to the practice of colonialism. So politically, that was an issue, right? Economically, that's easy to see because we could just factor in capitalism, and we all understand that capitalism requires the destruction of nature to transform it into wealth. So that's a pretty easy connection there, right? Socially, or I could say even psychologically, the problem comes from the idea that generally mainstream Canadians buy into the idea of Europeans having the advanced civilization myth. And that leads to the concept that because they're the advanced civilization, they have the right to rule over indigenous nations, indigenous territories, indigenous peoples. And everything that gets factored into that, racism and concepts of supremacy, accommodate that kind of social, psychological context, right? And then I could say religiously and spiritually, there's a problem. And that problem is from an indigenous spiritual point of view. And again, I don't want to create a pan-Indian kind of thought. I recognize each indigenous nation has their own concepts of spirituality and culture. I'm just speaking in a very general way, so let's acknowledge that, right? But indigenous spiritualism generally is animistic. It believes in a spirit or life force in all things, the mountains, the forests, the rivers, the animals, the trees, the fish. All things have a life force, spirit. And if they do, that means we can interact with them. We can connect with them. We can have a relationship with all things that have spirit. That's where the concept of everything around us is our relations, because we can have those interactions. So to us, our world is spiritually, it's a paradise. It's filled so much with spiritual life. And from a Christian point of view, the world outside of humans, the trees, the forests, the fish, the animals, are soulless. And that makes them very easy to objectify. And it's only one step further going from objectifying to commodifying. So in a Christian point of view, the world is more like a spiritual wasteland, a desert. There's no life out there from the spiritual point of view. From the indigenous point of view, there is a connection of value that goes beyond the idea of commodifying or objectifying. So that presents a problem. And historically speaking, we're going to talk a little bit about settler colonialism. The concept behind settler colonialism is you need to destroy to replace. And that means is you need to destroy the indigenous world, our governing system, our social institutions, our economics institutions, us, ourselves, have to be removed from the land. You have to destroy everything that makes up the indigenous world, indigenous civilization. And that leads to the indigenous apocalypse. That's generally what we mean by the apocalypse, right? The end of one's world or the end of one's civilization. So this historical project of settler colonialism destroys the indigenous world and replaces it with a European style world, one under European power, authority, sovereignty, one of their government institutions, social institutions, economic systems, completely replaces what was indigenous. And now we're going to really recognize this. It was that replacement, that colonial practice of replacing everything, that allowed the colonizer to be able to take so much from indigenous nations that it was the economic fuel that created the Industrial Revolution. It was the wealth of the Americas that fed that Industrial Revolution. And I think we're all aware Western industrial society is what's destroying nature. So we have to make that historical connections to see how colonialism becomes the foundation of Western industrial society, which is the threat or the problem behind this idea of climate crisis.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with that more. I think the points at which I jump in on are kind of tied together, but yeah, the idea of kinship and governance, and then how that relates to the like political problem that we just heard about, and yeah, and I think it is really important to kind of continuously assert, you know, and again, without using a pan-indigenous a definition, because I think that's also very important, but that, you know, webs of kinship were foundational to the ways in which indigenous people not only like understood themselves or do understand themselves now in relationship to the land, but also in the ways in which our societies and our communities were governed. And those webs of kinship, both like within communities, form the political systems through which we made governance decisions about, you know, how to live in concert with the land, and our ideas of kinship, our spiritual connections to the land, the water, the animals, and the plants that lived here were also like taken into consideration in those decision-making processes, right? And so when we ask the question, like, how does colonialism relate to climate change? I think we have to actually understand that, you know, the Canadian state is a project of extractivism, right? It's this project of extractive economy. It basically exists in order to ensure the like continued flow of resources out of these territories into the hands of, as farther up the pyramid you get, an increasingly small number of people who are really benefiting from that. But those people aren't just the CEOs of corporations, they're also the politicians and the people making decisions in Canada. Corporations couldn't do any of the things that they do here on those territories if it wasn't for the Canadian state backing them up with the might of the police and the military. That is their muscle. Those are not two separate entities, right? And so when we look at exactly what Saka's just saying is this replacement, you see that the project was to come into these territories to destroy the webs of kinship which existed here for the tens of thousands of years, that guaranteed a consideration and a respect for the environment that just like didn't allow for the kind of extractive industry that settlers needed and wanted. And so we see a destruction of that through, not only like residential schools, but just like mass starvation and like mass extinction of animals like the bison, right? Very intentional moves that were made to destroy those webs of kinship, to replace it with the Canadian state, which is then a machine whose function is to extract resources. So I think that the main point that I would want to take away from that is this idea that I think that it's really easy for people to talk about capitalism and talk about how capitalism is the problem. And like Zach just said, like I think a lot of people do see climate change as merely kind of like an economic problem, like, oh, we just like went a bit too far in this direction, but we could just like change the economics and the state will just facilitate this new system. But in actuality, we actually really have to take a closer look at how and why states formed, and to what ends they really serve. And I think we have to be a lot more critical of the ideas that we can just kind of like seize the state and like turn it into a vehicle for positive change. So that's what I'll end with there.
Wow, thank you so much. Like, it's really interesting, all of your answers. It's like I'm learning so much. I've been taking notes and everything. I'm gonna use them and share them. So thank you. And to continue on that, maybe we can go towards, like, in your view, what does decolonizing Canada mean? Like, what would this look like and why would it help address the climate crisis?
Sure, I'll go first that time. Just seamlessly from what I was saying before is that, I've gone over this question for a long time, and I started talking about it like 6 years ago or something, when the state started coming out with their kind of like official reconciliation rhetoric, the first time Justin Trudeau got elected. And the reality of it is that I actually just don't believe that there is kind of like a decolonial future that doesn't involve the dismantling of centralized state power. We talk about, I think, that the piece Decolonization is not a metaphor was very pivotal at the time it was written. And I think it's still a very powerful piece to kind of, at the time, if you don't know, Eve Tuck and Yang wrote this academic article that was positing the theory, or at least the declaration, that like decolonization is not just like a thing you do in your mind, it's the physical return of land. And I think when we really like problematize that more and like go through like what would it actually take to return land to Indigenous people, you really have to like go through the political will there, and you have to really understand that like the Canadian state is not ever going to return land to Indigenous people, because in the system in which it's entrenched, in which the system in which it needs to survive, which is the continuous extraction of resources, land is capital, and so land is money. And you know, being so intertwined with capitalism, like there's no internal logic that would allow the transfer of that much wealth back to Indigenous. You know, and land is also power when it comes to the nation state. And there's no way that they could reconcile giving away that much power. So what you actually have here, when you look at Canada and you really think about it, is this massive landmass. Like Canada as a state is huge. There's actually like no real authority that the Canadian government has over all of that territory. Like they don't have police and military everywhere. They don't even have settlers everywhere. But the like process of enclosure through colonization, you know, they managed to, at least at one point, weaken so many Indigenous nations through the process of colonization that they could kind of just lay claim to the whole thing. And even when they actually started running out of settlers to like take up that land and live there and hold it in trust for Canada, which is what, you know, individual settlers did and like continue to do, is like land hold for the state of Canada. They just declared the other swaths of unsettled land as crown land, right? And then they kicked Indigenous people off that and they put them under reserves. There is an abundance of land that Canada, so-called Canada, owns. Do you know what I mean? There's actually like, it's not that there's a shortage of places to give people to live or to live off that land, but the internal logic of Canada just can't actually reconcile with that. And so, yeah, like I said, I would continue to draw attention to the fact that I actually don't think that the return of land is possible, so long as like a centralized power like Canada exists. I think that if that power dynamic was turned on its head, if the state was dismantled and people were, again, you know, living in smaller communities, in charge of their own communities and making decisions together, then I think the question of how much land can you hold, what land are you using, and like what land can you give back, I think that whole question becomes a lot less complicated. And when you don't have the immense like consolidated power of like a nation state's military or police, you know, if that's dismantled, then I think the question hold back land from Indigenous people really goes away. So yeah.
Sorry, I missed the last bit. You said because it got frozen a little bit. Could you just repeat?
I'm just saying that you know, I think if you dismantle like the idea and the physical statehood of Canada, then you're also dismantling that military and police power that is so powerful and really only exists to the scope and scale and authority that it has now because of the ability to pool resources from all of across Canada and all of the different provinces and territories. I think if you remove that consolidated you know, coercive force, then I think there's not really a way to keep land from Indigenous people anymore anyway.
I see. Okay, great. Thank you. I think someone was unmuted. I just want to be sure that, okay, great. Perfect. Thank you. Yes, I'll let, so yeah, sorry, I got distracted a little bit. Yeah, I'll let Sakesh go.
Those are all excellent points. I think the way I'll address this is when I think about decolonizing Canada, for me, it's pretty basic. What I'm really talking about is restoring Indigenous nations. Right? I am talking about dismantling a European nation state, right? And I don't for a moment take that lightly in the sense that I don't think a nation state will easily be dismantled. I recognize the obstacles involved in that, but I also recognize the outcome if it's not happening. If we don't see a dismantling of this nation state that is the practitioner and protector and promoter of Western industrial society, we already can see where that's going, right? We could already see the death of nature as a result. So when I say that, I hope what it does is I want to shift a lot of thinking around this. I feel decolonization, the way we speak about it, has been very reformist, right? And what I mean by that is we're seeking a change in the system. I believe you're going to talk about decolonization, you need to speak from a point of view of being revolutionary. That means you want to change the entire system. I don't want to just create a change in the system. I want to create a change of the entire system, right? And I think it was brought up the idea that I'm not advocating the idea of let's put an Indigenous face on the structure of a European nation state, because it is the way that a nation state, a centralized power, wields power that is very problematic, right? So when I speak about this, I'm talking about, when I say returning to Indigenous nations, I'm talking about their governing practices also, and their ideas of responsibility to the land and the way they relate to the land. It's in that context that we can start to understand how this side of the world looked in 1491. We can recognize that it was an ecological paradise, not by happenstance, not by chance. It was that way because of a frame of thinking of how to relate to the land in a good way, in a mutually beneficial way. And that will only come back with if you restore an entire system, a way of thinking, a culture, the governance that comes with it. So when I talk about restoring Indigenous nations, I'm talking about in their entirety, not just a geographical space, not just political power, but the way of thinking, the way of being that comes with that, the culture that comes with that particular nation, because that's how we're going to be able to combat climate crisis in a real sense. But again, don't for a moment think that I am somehow downplaying what that looks like. I understand that nation states would not give up that kind of power. They would not give up that land. They would not restore Indigenous nations without a fight. And I think history has taught us that nation states don't know how to give up their concept of sovereignty without resorting to force. So I recognize that that is part of the problem. And that's what I'm saying is we just approach this from a reformist point of view. We will never be able to make the changes that need to be made. We have to approach this from a revolutionary point of view and understand that we might even have to transform, shape organizations different to take on a much more broader sense of this fight.
Thank you. So we really need to change everything. Well, restore more. Like I like this word, restore. And I think it makes me think also of healing. So yeah, thank you. So for the next question, the last question of this first part is, well, to you both, what will a decolonial climate movement look like? We already spoke about like how it has to be really to transform, to restore everything, but what would the demands be? What would be the strategies, sorry, and how would movement decisions will be made?
I think that I maybe don't have a long answer to this, which I think that a lot of what was just said kind of, paints a bit of a roadmap in terms of just like questions that maybe need to be asked or things that need to be looked at that have not. I think I 100% agree with the critique that that many of the like more mainstream climate change movements have kind of inevitably focused on reformist strategies or have kind of fallen victim to the idea that change can only come from the state, like it's only Canada that can save us or something, like it's only top-down solutions that are going to be able to stop this crisis from happening. But I think that a lot of the time, I mean, this is not even, we can borrow wisdom from other movements, but you know, asking the entity that caused the problem to solve the problem is not often a very winning solution. And I think that it is true that I think a lot of the times we fall into these situations because let's face it, we are living in a time in which globalization has become totalized, in which surveillance and like the power of the state, including just the military might that it has behind it, is kind of like unparalleled, you know. You know, the state has nuclear weapons. That's like, you know, it's a really intense power differential. And so I think that sometimes, you know, dreaming the big dream and saying like, being able to say like the system actually doesn't work, and we can't ask them to change because they can't change, and also they can't solve this problem because they're actively daily causing this problem, and solving this problem would mean the demise of that system that they all depend on, and we know very well that just doesn't really happen. However, you know, I think that a lot of the time then a lot of climate change movements fall victim to this idea that because it feels somewhat impossible, they go with a more reasonable sounding solution. But unfortunately, that solution is often just not a real solution. And it falls short. And in the meantime, you know, like at the last 20 to 25 to 30 years, you know, in my lifetime, it's not just about educating people and changing hearts and minds, you know, because we've been talking about climate change and talking about environmental catastrophe my entire life. And these nation states, when they get together in their big conferences, they can't sign on to any binding agreement whatsoever. It's just not going to happen. And here we are, you know, when I was a teenager, they used to tell us in school, oh, you know, global warming is a thing, but like probably you're not going to really see like the major effects of that. That will be your kids, your grandkids. And here I am at 33, you know, expecting a kid of my own and realizing like, no, like this is probably all going to go down in my lifetime, actually. And I don't even know if this kid's going to live to be the same age that I am now. And even you know, that is the fault of both the corporations and the states involved. And I don't find any solace in hoping that they're about to just have a massive change of heart and completely destroy themselves to save the rest of us. So.
Thank you. And oh, sorry, Sekij. Just want to say, like, I had the incredible opportunity to go to the COP25 already my God, for me, it's like a few months ago, but it's been like really long ago. And yeah, I was able to assist to some discussions from like, I forgot the preliminary discussions with Indigenous peoples from around the world. And it's a lot of talk, like we have such a small space to talk about our realities, and we all put in the same basket. So, and it's a lot of, okay, so what can we say, but not a lot of what kind of agreements we can agree on or like sign on, like you said, so we can have like impacts, real impacts. So yeah, I resonated with what you said. Thank you. And I'll let Sekij continue.
Sure. I'll come back to the idea that I said that the way we need to address this is the dismantling of the European concept of the nation state and the governance that follows, the practices, procedures that comes with that way of governance, and the returning or reemplacing of Indigenous nations. So I'm going to center that to kind of explain this. So I feel that real climate crisis activists, there's a movement around that has to address the concept of colonialism that accompanies climate crisis. again, would have to start to think about restructuring as like a revolutionary organization as opposed to a reformist one. And that means, and I'm hoping what that means is that they'll go back and revisit what does that strategic vision look like? Initially, a strategic vision of a climate activist group might be, let's get certain legislation passed at the national level, or let's get it passed at the UN. Let's get certain laws in place. Let's hit certain targets. Those might be the goals initially. But if you start to see this from a broader sense, then we might start to say that, no, that vision needs to change because the nation state apparatus and its practices won't allow for the correct changes to happen, real meaningful changes to happen. It's not that it doesn't exist outside its power. It exists outside its will. They benefit from the crisis. They benefit from all this. So they're not willing to give that up. And we understand the power associated with that to make sure they don't have to give up the wealth and the benefits that come with that. So as I said, restructuring as revolutionary organizations would mean things like, what kind of new strategic vision do we have? What kind of goals are we pulling out of that vision? And then how we turn those into concrete objectives that we can create strategic planning around, right? And if I was to suggest that replacing Indigenous nations is the first kind of strategic goal as a way of saying that power will now be exercised very differently in a way that will be much more beneficial to all people as well as life on the lands. I could start there and say that becomes one of the goals. And as you could see, it kind of reshifts the way planning might happen. You're no longer looking to get a certain law passed. You're no longer looking to enforce an existing regulation. You're now talking about changing the entire spectrum of the political realm, the political atmosphere, and place it in the hands of those who already knew how to handle this properly to begin with, right? So that would be my suggestion: is the amount of shift that has to happen in strategic visioning, strategic planning, reorganizing, and even at the individual level, the decolonizing to be able to see the world through a different worldview, to be able to see it from an Indigenous point of view. I think all that work has to take place. If we can't do it, or if we do it only in piecemeal, well, we're not going to be able to take on such a huge opposing force. It's an asymmetrical style conflict where we have one very small, disempowered group up against the powers of nation states. That's so asymmetrical. So anything we do, we have to really become very good at creating the quality, not so much the quantity, but the quality of those that are involved in the movements. So that, as I said, that means shifting the way we think, shifting the way we act, as well as creating the specific skill sets that are needed to take on these new strategic objectives.
Thank you again. Sorry, I'm just like taking a lot of notes. Great. So I guess now we already talked about a little bit about that, about allyship, so we can go there. So thank you first for just answering those questions. It really helps us to see clearer. And now we would like to talk about the ways current climate movements in Canada are not yet living up to such visions, to our visions of decolonizing. So can you describe some of the ways you see the current movement falling short? Was it clear? So I tried to change it because I didn't, but
I was going to suggest JD and go right ahead.
No, I think it was clear. I think I'm thinking maybe like I feel like I already answered that a little bit in the last question. So I would just I would kind of just reiterate the main points of like I think that there's like maybe a lack of willingness to stop asking the state to solve the problem, and that goes hand in hand with like maybe a lack of imagination, also maybe just like a lack of like just time spent really like analyzing nation statehood, like Zach was just saying, like European Western nation statehood, and like really being able to identify it as a problem. So I think there's like maybe a gap in like knowledge there. And then I think there's gaps in understanding about the history of colonialism, and also gaps in understanding of you know, Indigenous governance and what that really means. And I think that those kind of go hand in hand with just kind of the lack of imagination of what could be different. I was like peeking at the chat, and I think we'll have time for questions after, but what someone asked, like, well, if we're not going to like get the state to solve the problems, like what are we supposed to do? Revolution? Like what's going to happen? I think that the biggest con of all of this is that we've been convinced, or you've been convinced, that there isn't another way that we could organize ourselves that wouldn't be actually just as effective or more effective, you know, and maybe that comes more naturally to Indigenous folks who understand how their governance systems worked and thrived and actually created very healthy societies in relationship with land. But it also just like, I think there's a lot of experimentation and out there right now with kind of like bottom-up governance or anarchist theories of social organization that are against centralization. So I think like actually like really digging into those things and understanding that there are actually, you know, many possibilities, as many possibilities as there are for economic systems that aren't capitalism. There are possibilities for political systems that aren't, you know, centralized nation states. Yeah, I'll leave that one there then. There's other things I'm going to say, but I think the next question will kind of lead into that. So.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I got trouble with my mute button, but thank you. And Sakich, sorry.
I think where we're falling short is there's barriers. I'm going to say the word inabilities, maybe. And it has a lot to do with what we're talking about right now. So I feel that in general, settler colonists have an inability to actually fathom or grasp the globally destructive force of empires, nation states, and colonialism itself. It's as if we want to dismiss the past. The past is in the past, it's history, let's not worry about that, let's focus on present issues, without recognizing it's that very past that has created the very conditions that allows our problem to exist and our crisis to exist in, right? So there's almost an inability to even acknowledge that. Then I think there's an inability to recognize how colonialism was such a powerfully destructive force to Indigenous people. I mentioned the word like apocalypse earlier. Colonialism is an apocalypse creating force. And the reason I think it's important to recognize that is we can't still try to maintain ties to it. We can't still somehow romanticize the colonial project as some kind of advancement in human history. We have to see it as this really destructive, inhumane force. Because once we can start making that realization, then we can start to say, okay, it's colonialism that created Western industrial revolution in the industrial states, and it's European colonialism that has led us to this particular problem where we're at right now. And the clearer we could see that, the more we could understand that the nation state doesn't hold the solution for us. It's the adversary to us. It doesn't have the solution there for us, right? So we're gonna make those things. And I think there's so many hurdles to being a settler on Indigenous territories that it's hard to grasp the enormity of that problem. Then I think there are issues around the inability to shed colonial baggage. So decolonization isn't just a burden for Indigenous people. We're actively trying to decolonize. We're actively trying to re-indigenize our ways of being, our ways of living, our ways of thinking. But we also have to acknowledge too that settlers that came over probably have a history of colonialism on their lands themselves. And that problem of holding on to colonial thought becomes really, it creates a lot of tension. It creates a lot of turmoil when you have allies that carry that colonial baggage into the fights. Sometimes we hear them self-declare or profess to be our allies without at all even talking to us, right? And I believe that should be a relationship where it's two ways. You could seek my friendship and become allies with me, but you can't just declare it. It's a relationship. It goes both ways. But if somebody's walking in with the intent of helping out, but they're carrying so much colonial baggage, it could be very problematic. And I'm going to give you an example of one of the things that I see so much of, and that's that white savior complex. So almost every kind of hotspot or crisis points I go to, there are many allies. I'm not going to say all, but there are many allies that come with some form of the white savior complex. And that's a form of colonial baggage because it comes from thinking you're coming from this advanced civilization, therefore you have the answers. Those that you're working for are more primitive or unaware. Therefore, you're carrying the answers with you. And that's where we get so many of these armchair generals, armchair strategists that come in telling us how to fight our own fight. And that's very problematic. So that colonial baggage, if we're trying to become an ally, I think part of this isn't just about showing up to the fight and self-declaring you're an ally. It's taking a moment to reflect on your own internalized colonialism and reflect on what kind of colonial practices and worldviews do you carry that need to be corrected in a way to be a better ally.
I agree. Thank you. Yeah, we talk a lot about decolonializing the state and everything, but it also touches us as well. Like I'm still decolonizing myself in many ways. And I see allies also really open to do that. So yeah, the next question is, I think it follows what we've talked about. It's to ask maybe more specific ways that settler climate activists have failed or are failing to practice real allyship, like real decolonial practices. So if there's anything you wanted to add, I'll let you go on. Yeah.
Oh, you wanted me to go first?
No, but everybody.
Sure. Gideon, would you like to go?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think the other thing that I was going to say before, but I waited until this question was that I think that another way that these like larger organizations sometimes fail is in their unwillingness or inability to actually support the like frontline struggles that are going on, and not just the ones that are like easily packageable and you know, good for fundraising or something like that, but the more messy frontline struggles that go on that also include like property destruction, you know, or like use of force. I think that you know, if that's kind of twofold, because when folks actually organize themselves into like nonprofit type organizations, there comes with it this kind of inability to publicly support those kinds of illegal actions, because you can get sued, you can lose your charitable status, like all these kinds of things. But there's also this kind of philosophical angle in which people have a really hard time understanding any sort of ideology that isn't kind of like Gandhian nonviolence or something like that, without like really, I think, realizing like what Saga just talked about, which is you know, the fact that any sort of resistance to climate change at this point, or state violence, is self-defense. Like we are literally living on a planet that is becoming quickly inhospitable and inhabitable for us. We are going to die, you know, like, and so are many other animals and plants that live here, and that, like, you know, myself and other Indigenous people see ourselves in kinship with. And so I think there becomes this failure in that regard. And maybe to add just a little bit on to the last question, you know, maybe in response to what Sakesh said is, yeah, this, you know, coming with this idea that people are still, you know, attached to, you know, if not being like a Canadian, then like being from a Western culture, like having these kinds of ideas. And I know I have many friends in Quebec and Montreal, and you know, I know that sometimes in the French speaking part of this country, it can be kind of this like double hurdle of also like not only kind of addressing the like uncomfortability with white folks accepting that they're settlers, but then also the additional hurdle of like many French speaking people feeling like they are an oppressed people in Canada, and that they like have this kind of like national identity, as also like acting in self-defense, but never in the context of actually wanting to like destroy Canada or like whatever, but just to, like get a bigger piece of that pie, and understanding that that in and of itself is violent, and that what we really need is for people to abandon the idea that Canada is a good place, that deserves preserving. And I mean, I think in the last year we've really seen with this, you know, continual uncovering of these like mass graves of children, you know, that like Zach was just saying, like colonialism was an apocalypse for Indigenous people. And I'm not sure that even with all the reflection and all of the like moments of silence, that most Canadians have ever really stopped and considered, you know, if Canada can only exist and only exist because of this like incredible violence against this other people and against the land, like does it deserve to exist at all? So yeah, I'll end that there. Pass it back over.
Thank you. I just want to say, like, also I can see sometimes the defensiveness of some people. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people and outside of my bubble, you know, and when I'm talking, for example, to a French speaker or Quebecois French, you know, some people are really like, how can I say that? I can't understand the shock of seeing that the place where you are so proud to be in created so many tragedies. So I can see the defensiveness, yeah. But I see also the people being open to learn more, and that's where I'm holding on to. And also like that's why I went to journalism and in French too, because I know there's a need to different perspectives, so people can see other perspectives as well. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's important to talk about that as well. But I'll let the second go on.
The next question in this allyship section is just, do you have anything else to add? And I'm just gonna say I don't, and I just have to pee like every 10 minutes now. So I'm just gonna go pee, but just keep going. Just keep it going.
Yeah. Go ahead. It's all fine. Thank you.
I want to begin by saying JDM was really nailing a lot of the same points that I want to say too. They were great points. In particular, this idea that settler climate activists are finding it difficult to transition or transform from an activist that is only willing to engage in, say, peaceful, nonviolent means, legal means, maybe, you know, if you push it to the extreme, maybe they'll engage in civil disobedience to some degree, right? But there is a real barrier. There's honestly a strong barrier there that prevents a lot of activists from going any further. Now, I suspect when I say revolution, it probably throws off some of the listeners here. And it's because when we hear revolution, again, we're putting this in a Western context. In the last couple of centuries, most of the time when we talk about revolution, we're talking about an armed struggle for the sake of seizing nation state power, like a central government power, right? And I'm saying revolution doesn't have to exist like that. I mean, it can include the idea of dismantling the nation state, and it should, but it can come from so many other possible approaches, like indigenous cultural resurgence, a re-envisioning of how spiritualism, indigenous spiritualism is applied today. There's a lot of different ways to approach this. And to me, there is no one specific, like the idea of just armed struggle, that's it. I feel that there is a broader context of how conflict, and I'm going to stray away from the term war, because that's so far on the extreme. But if I say conflict can include struggles around economic conflict, political conflict, social conflict, ideology conflict, all these things that get encompassed into it, we are opening that battlefield up to other possible tactics and strategies beyond just simply let's sit down and slug it out with the nation state, right? So that's one of the things I want to point out. And in that context, I think the unwillingness of many settler activists to get involved on something beyond simply what do you have permission to do by the state, I think that becomes a huge problem. And there's a historical lesson. Actually, I'm just going to say one, but there's several of them that we really have to think about for a moment. And I'm going to look at Tecumseh. Now, Tecumseh obviously was a war chief, and he had created like an allyship, an army of indigenous warriors from many different indigenous nations. And he chose to ally with the British against the Americans who were expanding and encroaching on their territory. So in this war, there was a particular battle where the British had told Tecumseh, said, listen, the Americans are coming. I believe they're about to cross the river. They could see the advancing troops of the Americans. And they said, he asked Tecumseh, that this particular British general asked Tecumseh, take your warriors and hold off the Americans. Buy us time so we can set up a defensive position many miles in the rear. We'll set it up, and then you could come back to us and we'll all be ready to fight. But just hold them off as long as you can to buy us time. So Tecumseh did that, at great cost, lost a lot of warriors, held off the Americans. And finally, when he went back to where the British defensive position was supposed to be, all there was a single cannon, no cannon crew. And the only reason it was there was abandoned because I believe the wheel had broken on the cannon. Now, Tecumseh just encountered the problem of relationship with European colonizers. And that's where indigenous people are consistently being urged or prodded, or I don't want to say the word instigated, but in a way pressured to do a lot of the work that carries consequence. Not just the hard work of being physically at the front lines, but I mean, a lot of the work that carries real consequence, right? So if we can talk about better allyship, or where some of the failings in allyship would be, is that consequence needs to be shared. If there is a success, there's a victory, well, then that's going to be a shared victory because all people will be able to benefit from stopping the destructive force of industrial nations, industrial power. Well, then we have to share in that consequence too. And I'm seeing a little bit more of it. We're seeing a little bit more of non-indigenous activists getting involved a little bit at the front lines. We like in Westoughton, for instance, I think Fairy Creek blockade, we're seeing a little bit more. But that really has to be pushed up. Like that's a real failing. It's easy to say, listen, I support those indigenous causes. Here's $20 that I'll send on some GoFundMe page, and that's it. Well, that's not enough. In effect, again, it's like Tecumseh being put in a position where he does all this hard work and suffers the consequence, comes back to the rear, and the British aren't there. His allies, his colonial allies, aren't there to do the hard work and suffer the consequence alongside him, right? So I do think we need to see more of this true commitment to the fight, to really, really treat it with a sense of urgency as it is a fight and get involved in that way.
Thank you. And if there's anything, and if there's nothing else you want to add about like where it goes wrong, I guess where it's more interesting, what real allyship looks like, so we can go to there. Are you both okay with that?
Sure.
Great. Yeah, you talked about hard work, and um, I guess I'll segue to to like I'm just reading the. You talked about like what. Okay, I'll just answer the question. I'm trying to be fancy, but it's not working. So, uh, so we know that decolonizing climate movement is required for is effectively and justly responding to climate crisis. What do climate activists need to know in order to actually decolonize their movements? I think we already talked about that. Now that I'm reading the question, I'm sorry. But let me know if there's something else you want to add about this.
Want to say anything, Jadian?
I think it's okay. I've been reading some of the questions that are coming up, and I think it'd be interesting to have more time to respond to them. So I think we are.
Okay, great.
I could probably add just a little bit, right? And I'm just reinforcing what we said earlier.
Yeah.
Honestly, to understand why this particular position of re-empowering Indigenous nations, dismantling European nation states, to understand that position, one does have to decolonize. And that means you're really going to have to take the time to go back and unlearn colonial education, right? And I think that's one of the barriers is the question of awareness around the history of colonization, the impacts and the direction, the trends, and where it leads to, right? I think the more we can understand this history, the more we can rule out some kind of like knee-jerk reactions that a settler might have in the kind of almost the defense of Western thought and Western society, right? So decolonization really has to start with the individual and really think about, go back, learn that history as objectively as possible without having a biased kind of position, going into it with a biased position, and trying to do nothing more than simply defend colonialism as you learn more and more about it, right? I think then we can broaden our discussions, and then we can start talking about more effective allyship. Once the history, the real brutal history of colonization is talked about, and how colonization has led us to this place of climate crisis.
Exactly. Thank you. So that's where I wanted to do the segue to when you talked about hard work, and I think it could we could go to the question: what does decolonizing look like in a day-to-day organizing? Like, yeah, what is the hard work that we need to do?
Yeah, so I can jump in there. I think that basically everything Saka just saying is kind of where I'm going with this as well. When it comes down to like what can you do as an individual, and I think you know, the reason why some of the questions that I'm seeing come up in the chat are very interesting to me are because a lot of them are in this vein of like, well, if we're not going to ask the state or demand of the state to fix this problem, like what do we do? You know, do we have time to like organize a revolution or something like that? And in reality, like what I really think is like the opposite, is like, do you have time to keep asking them to do something about it? Like the easy part about the alternative is that you can just go and do something right now. Like you can go and you can grab 3 of your friends and you can say, hey, that subdivision down the road that is going to destroy this watershed, or this logging project that is accelerating, you know, 2 hours away, or whatever it might be, like it's just unacceptable, and it doesn't fit into a future in which we still live on this planet. And then you can go and do something about it, you know. You can get up and you can go to an Indigenous front line and you can ask them what they need. And I think like in a lot of ways, I think it would be really interesting to see kind of these mainstream or like larger climate movements kind of shift their focus to actually be maybe like less understanding of people that aren't willing to go out there and do something about it. Like Saka just saying, like You know, what would it look like for people to say, we actually don't want your money, we just want you to come out and do something about this? You know, we actually you know, for them to actually say, like, we actually need people to put themselves on the line. You're going to have to be a little bit uncomfortable if you want this world to be a habitable place for your grandchildren. And I think Zach had just something earlier that like stuck in my head. He's actually, you've got a couple of good lines today that I wrote down, but one of them was like, we need like quality, like more quality people over quantity. And I think that that is really true, because to be honest, like when you actually look at like how many people come out to these climate marches, right? Like these big climate marches, every single time one of them happens, I'm just blown away with how many people understand on a basic level that we're kind of doomed, you know, we're fucked, to like spare no language here, and that like things need to change right away. And so it's like people understand the problem, but I think they're getting lost in the solution. And they go to the climate march and then they donate their money that month and they think some good people are working on this and they're going to convince the government to do something about it. And, you know, if they can't convince this government, then we just got to focus on electing a new government in 4 years that will do something about it then, you know. And all of these solutions are just kind of kicking the can down the road. And I think that the numbers of people that are there that would be necessary to actually create such chaos that it would overwhelm the capacities of a state like Canada to police all of the front lines, like the numbers are already there, right? It's actually about convincing those people that the solution isn't asking nicely, and then actually if that's what we're all going to fall back on, then I guess we're all going to die. You know, it's about having a more radical conversation. One of the questions in the chat was talking a little bit about like where do non-Indigenous people fit into this, and the facts of the matter is like I'm not a proponent of like sending people back to Europe or like wherever. I think people are gonna stay here and they're gonna live here, and I think that like settlers really need to figure out how they want to live here, because I don't think that the current system is working, and I don't think that, you know, that a solution is just giving some land back to Indigenous people and then Canadians continuing on business as usual and attempting to live sustainably on the land under the current system. I think that in actuality, it's going to me, I'll just go back to something that I've said many times before that I'll continue to say, which is that, you know, when you rely on centralized authorities to make decisions about land use for you, what you end up having is a system that allows for sacrifice zones to be created for the greater good of the regions in which people are living. And it's easy to place that coal mine out of sight and out of mind of an urban center when it's actually like a different structure of power, and it's people making decisions, who are the people who actually live and use the land that they're on. And that's the authority that they have, is like how are we going to like use and manage this land? How are we going to you know, have clean water, to do all the things that we need to do? When it's a bottom-up approach, when it's a decentralized approach to government, and you are empowered to make decisions about, you know, the place that you live, you're gonna just see less gravel pits and less coal mines, right? If the decision is, hey, we could open up a gravel pit, but it's gonna poison the river that we all depend on to drink from, you know, people aren't gonna do that as much. Like if you don't have the capability of creating sacrifice zones, that level of impossible anymore. And so I think settlers have a real task ahead of them, or ahead of you, to really re-envision like what kind of society do you want for yourselves. I think Indigenous people have thought about that a lot and have, you know, they have good models, they have ideas of like what they want to go back to, and not even go back, right? Like they have ideas of ways to make it better, because we're not just static people stuck in the past, right? And I think that question is very much a question for settlers as well. And I think that it has to be a question that's independently answered by yourselves and for yourselves. But I think that understanding Indigenous governance and understanding what justice looks like for Indigenous people from the mouths of Indigenous people, and understanding how Indigenous people would choose to live here and govern themselves is an absolute prerequisite to that, because any form of new societal organization that settlers want to introduce won't be just if it doesn't actually just like support and uplift Indigenous people to reclaim you know, the space and the governance systems that are rightfully theirs. I'll pass it back.
Thank you.
I too could add a little bit to that.
Yeah.
Sure. I think what's being said is very much like we're talking about day-to-day kind of decolonization, but yeah, shifting back to the kind of individual perspective and what can the individual do. And I would say not just individual, but even an organization. So a climate justice, climate crisis activist organization, what can they do? Well, we can recognize that the nation state is unwilling to have a relationship with Indigenous nations. And I mean a very traditional idea of Indigenous nations, not like Indian Act, chief and council system. We know the nation state is unwilling to validate or legitimize the traditional Indigenous leaders. The nation state is unwilling to acknowledge Indigenous ways of governance. But I think that's something that the individual and organizations can start to do. And I think it's really important. It shouldn't be just a simple gesture. I think settler organizations and settlers as individuals need to start with the recognition of, well, whose national territory are you on? And who are the legitimate leaders of that territory? Because that will start to at least give you an approach to where you should start the direct relationships with, right? Who are the people that you should start to reach out to and connect to? And then I'm gonna go further with that. I'm gonna say, to create a good relationship, you should really be thinking about, do you have, in effect, the idea of permission to be waging actions and operations in that nation without Indigenous traditional leadership saying so, right? And I don't want to present that as a barrier, because I can almost guarantee you, if you present this to an Indigenous traditional grassroots leader or traditional leader, they'd be more than happy to embrace what you're doing and find ways of making it happen. And that's part of what relationship building is about, right? So I would suggest, making those relationships. Go connect with the people that are authentically the legitimate leaders of this land, and then start to see how your actions, how your operations, your campaigns fit in with the overall strategic view or strategic vision that Indigenous nations and leaders may have. And then you'll find a way of syncing this up, because I feel that there's enough common ground there that you'll be able to say, oh, I could see how my action might support one of your goals here. Or I could see how one of our campaigns, we can assist each other as mutual partners on this and that. And that is the context of relationship building. For Indigenous people, our culture is all about relationship building and relationship maintenance. And I think people kind of, in a very romanticized way, just simply say Indigenous culture is about like nature worship or something like that, right? And they're missing the point. The point is about relationships. It's how we maintain very specific conditions of relationships with humans and non-human beings, right? And it's the act, the process of creating those relationships that is so important. Now, I'm saying this from the point of view that my people are called Mi'kmaq. And that if you take that word and you translate it, it means allies, kinsmen, kinship. And it's actually, it's a post-colonial word because it's in relation to our relationship with the French. Previous to that, we used to call ourselves Ilnu, which just meant the people, right? So if there's anybody who understands the concept of relationship building, relationship maintenance, it's a people who actually call themselves, the name of our identity is allies, right? And we have to refoster that, rebuild that. And we can't let the nation state's absence of relationship building or maintain those relationships be a problem. If they're not willing to do it, we need to do it at our own level, that's grassroots level, and make those relationships happen. Because that's when we can start to re-empower certain goals and visions that we need to achieve.
Thank you again. Really interesting answers. Really, I just have the word in French. I forgot. Enriching. Anyway, thank you. I guess one last question before we go to the questions of everybody. There's really great questions that I hope we'll be able to answer. But one last question will be like, have you seen any real example of what real decolonial climate action and allyship looks like? Sorry. And have you seen real example of real decolonial climate action and allyships? And if so, which one?
You have something, Jadian?
It can be no too.
I would say that that during the Wet and Struggle a year ago or whenever that was, I don't even know what year it is anymore, when Shutdown Canada was happening, and there were actually many folks, including many people who I think maybe had not previously engaged in types of illegal action, actually did so. And I think there was a lot of calls to shut down trains. And I think we saw a lot of experimentation during that time that I really respected. A lot of people are really trying to figure out, like, how do you stop a train? What are the 10 ways you can being brave enough to try out some of those things, probably for the first time. I also think that this last year, and although maybe this ending is not as happy as we want, like stuff that happened in the Line 3 campaign in the States was also like very inspiring to me. I think in the last year, something I've really been like just kind of blown away by is seemingly the like scale up in like tactics that I've seen people get trained up in. So like not just, you know, standing in a road until the police carry you away, but like multiple levels of like different you know, road blockades and like and barriers that take, you know, 3, 4, or 5, you know, times as long to dismantle them. And you know, in regards to like Fairy Creek and stuff like that, some of the things I've heard that I did really appreciate is kind of like a culture that grew amongst the camps of people getting arrested and then getting out, signing the papers that said like, I promise to not go back to any of these sites or like whatever, but then just like immediately going back, then like over and over and over and over again, you know, and just like practicing a culture of defiance to those colonial laws. I think that, yeah, I can't say that there's like many like complete movements that I can point to and be like, that one got it exactly right. But I do attempt to kind of live in a space where I don't allow myself to just sink into the kind of the hopelessness of our situation. I do try to look for the like small signs that I think that people are waking up to what actually needs to be done. And I think that in the last year, I actually did see a lot of those little signs. I saw people, you know, going out in mass numbers and for long periods of time, despite COVID and despite COVID restrictions. So like putting their own safety on the line and like those kinds of things. I saw people like, yeah, like I said, like really scaling up their tactics, really like acting in defiance of the law, and really learning kind of how to defend legal actions. So I think like in, you know, in my framework that I've talked a lot about tonight, talking about, you know, dismantling centralized authority, a key facet of that is just learning how to see the laws of those states as illegitimate, right? Seeing the laws that states create to protect corporations and the police forces that they bring in to enforce those laws as illegitimate, is a great first step at actually like taking the kinds of actions that I think we really need to be taking. So.
Thank you. And do you have anything to add, Sakish?
Oh,
Sakish, sorry.
I thought it did, but really JG nailed it. Those are the exact same examples I was going to use, particularly the shutdown Canada with Soden, Ferry Creek blockade. I think, and as she was saying, there is no entirety of a case study or a perfect example. It doesn't exist. There are elements, there are individuals, there are people kind of stepping up and doing these things on their own that are really kind of, to me, they're setting an example as to what good allyship can look like. The only thing I could really think to add to that is it's a small story, and I know the Mohawk tell this story far better than I can because it's about their crisis, and this would have been Oka. I believe it was at the treatment center when it was being surrounded by the military. There was a young man, I believe, he's a teenager, I believe he was 15, non-native young teenager who snuck in. So he got through where the military lines was, and he snuck in to the treatment center that's being surrounded to do what he could to assist. And I thought, wow, what a great example of this person willing to put their life and liberty on the line, that hard work we're talking about, right? So it's more than beyond just, you know, putting material or property at risk. Life and liberty is much more important than property, right? So this young man really set a great example of what it means to be that ally who is going to take on those same associated risks, and perhaps even suffer the same consequences. So if we could look to actions like that, I think those are really important. Now, I do want to just kind of compare and contrast this a little bit. And I know we kind of already spoke about the idea of failures of allyship, but I want to make sure there's one that, at least from my point of view, that's not misunderstood. And that would be like Standing Rock. I think a lot of people point to that as some kind of victory, some kind of real, you know, generating of allyship and stuff. And from those engaged in Indigenous resistance, we don't see it so much like that. Now, of course, I'm not speaking for the people of Standing Rock. Maybe perhaps they have completely different perception of this. But the perception we have is we've seen a lot of, we're using the term recolonizing. And what I mean by that are allies that come in that immediately want to occupy positions of power, decision-making, or influence within Indigenous struggles. They're not happy to be a supporter or play in a secondary narrative where they're no longer the star of that narrative. It's hard for them to kind of just accept the fact you're merely just one of the people there that's engaged in the work. From the analysis we had was that there was a lot of allies trying to acquire positions of lower and middle level kind of power. And I don't want to construct this as hierarchical, but in a way they were kind of doing this. And I got a lot of stories about it. But also influence, to influence the key strategists, to influence the key decision makers. So on the outside, one may say, hey, Standing Rock is a great example, or might be one of these examples you could use of allyship where it went right and how things went. And I'm just going to say from an Indigenous resistance point of view, I don't think that's really the case. I would look more towards Wissodin, Ferry Creek blockade, even like that example I gave you of Oka. Those to me are more the authentic kind of supports and engagements that we should see from non-Indigenous climate activists really trying to get involved in that part of the fight.
Really interesting. I didn't know about that. I didn't think about that also for Standing Rock. So thank you for bringing that up. And also, I think it falls like in the category of white saviors also as well, and also like people who like to be the martyrs. Martyrs, is that the word?
Yep.
Like we can see this happening, but like we mentioned, there's so many allies who are open to rethink that, and we can see it tonight, like with all the people here. So if you don't have anything to add, we can go to the questions to if you're okay with that. Jadine, you okay?
Yeah.
So I see a little tiny head. Okay, now you're big because you talked. You hi. So I couldn't see if you were okay with that. I guess we'll start with one question that I think it's really interesting, that and thank you for asking it, because most of the people here are from Quebec as well. So in Quebec, we feel a disconnection from the rest of Canada. It's hard to know what's happening outside Quebec. How do you think Quebec specifically need to engage nationwide for climate justice in a decolonized way? Where is Quebec missing in the nationwide fight? I know maybe it will be interesting to know about your opinions, but you're also outside of Quebec, so I can understand that you can all have the answers, but yeah, I'll let you know if you're comfortable in answering this question.
I don't know. I mean, I could just very briefly just say, like, I don't know that you necessarily have to be engaged in a fight outside Quebec. I mean, one thing I would say is, like, I meet lots of francophones at different front lines, actually. Like, I think there are folks who actually speak very little English that make it a priority to just, like, go kind of far away, even out to Ontario, and get involved in stuff. But I mean, I would just say, like, just figure out how to fight for Indigenous sovereignty and land defense, like where you're at. Like, there's lots going on in Quebec. Like, I don't think you necessarily have to support struggles that happen really far away. And in fact, I think sometimes we get really caught up in whatever the most exciting front line is, really far away. And in reality, there's lots to be done in everybody's general vicinity. So
yes, exactly. And do you have anything to add, Sakic? Sakic, I have trouble with your name tonight. I don't know why.
No, you got it there, Sakic.
Sakic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I'm just starting to kind of think about this now, but maybe perhaps, and again, this is just conceptualizing. Could those in Quebec, the French, actually start to show what a new relationship with Indigenous people would look like? And it would really, in my view, to be a more authentic relationship, one that exists outside of colonization. It would have to start on the fringes, and that would be like those at the grassroots organizations, those that are traditionalists, those that are engaged in Indigenous resistance, those Indigenous people who have moved away from the colonized, assimilated kind of daily politics, and they've probably taken up their role of protecting the land because they are re-indigenizing themselves. And if we could see, could there be a relationship with the French and the Indigenous people like that? Could that now set the model? Could that set the example to the way the rest of Canadians would start to look at how do they recreate these relationships? And I say it in the sense that I think a lot of times we see relationship as static. We put a label on it. We say, I'm your friend, I'm your ally. And we don't think there's any more work behind it after that. But real relationships are all about maintenance. How do we maintain good, positive, mutually beneficial interactions between each other, right? So is this an opportunity, if anything, to demonstrate what a good non-colonial or even anti-colonial relationship could look like? So I'm suggesting that's a possibility. Now, keep in mind, I'm coming from the place where my community, Escanovich, where we were in a conflict back in 2000, 2001 over a fishery fight. So if you remember the what was referred to as the Micmac Treaty conflict or the lobster wars, I think the CBC was calling it. But in 2000, 2001, we spent a lot of time fighting. I mean, physically fighting, where there were shots being fired with French fishermen that's surrounded, because my community is surrounded by a lot of French communities. So that is exactly how not to have the relationship. That is the colonial relationship. It's there we're seeing a lot of French fishermen wanting control of an indigenous resource that was never given to them, right? The Micmac relationship was we never surrendered that. We never gave it away. It was just taken by theft and by lies. So that would be the wrong relationship. Can we say there should be a different relationship, and what does that look like? So I'm saying that there can be opportunity to shape that now and demonstrate what an anti-colonial authentic relationship could look like.
Thank you. And also I agree also with Jadine that we have a lot to do here as well in Quebec. Like I could see there was less support during le moratoire de la chasse à l'orignal. What's it? Is it in French? In English, it's moratorium, like of hunting the orignal.
Moose hunting moratorium.
Scrambled, but there was a movement here in not far from here about stopping hunting orignal is moose. Thank you, Rosalie. Of something, because the moose population is decreasing rapidly. There was a lot of separation in that way. So I think we need a lot more allies in our fights as well here. And it's if you're near Montreal, it's just 2 hours from here. Like it's a big park that we have here. So it's only one of the things. We have so many things, and I've seen also a lot of allies went together, allies with us. With Joyce, I mean, all the people walking, or like I think it's important that we have all of us working towards one thing. I keep thinking about the community aspect of our values and everything, and we all have a role in everything. So it's, if we each do what we need to do, we're going to be stronger. So, but it's also interesting, important to know what's going on outside. So thank you also for being here and teaching us. And just want to see if there's, I don't know, there's so many questions. I don't know which one.
Yeah, I was thinking like maybe like, because we're a bit over time, and I go probably like 9.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm wondering if like maybe like Sagaj, you want to just like pick one more question out of that list and we can both answer it.
Yeah, perfect.
Something like that.
Thank you for the suggestion. It's perfect. Thank you. Because we have a list, you both have access to it?
On the chat, correct?
Well, we have a Google Doc. Sorry, guys, it was a secret. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Do you have the Google Doc that we used with the master agenda that we had at the beginning?
I'll send. I can send it just to you.
Okay.
Actually, my computer is being really slow. Oh, there we go.
I can share it too, and you can check get link. Okay, I have the link. You can find a question you want to answer, Jadine, and I'm gonna send it to Sakish.
Great. Yeah, but pick one more question to answer. I feel like some of the questions have been answered already. So
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I've answered a lot of the ones that were left. The one that maybe I would answer is someone asking like, why not take the best of both worlds and create a new world? And maybe I have just like a short answer to that, but I want to just like maybe reiterate that I don't think it should be the goal of settler activists to assume that Indigenous people and settlers are fighting for a co-created world after capitalism or the state. You know, I think that that Indigenous people deserve, and in most cases that I know, like, desire, the land and the space and the freedom and the autonomy to actually like rebuild their communities and their societies the way that they want. So this is not really a question of like, let's just like take some good things from Indigenous cultures and some good things from Western cultures, like mash them together and like make a new thing. I think that actually like settlers have a responsibility among to figure out how to fix the problem that you created, and Indigenous people have kind of the right to have the freedom and autonomy to define and redefine for themselves how they want to live in relation to each other and to the land, and in that regard in relation to settlers, right? But I think that that new relationship that actually could be formed in a different way of living would also really depend on how well settlers restructured their society to be one that actually like respects the land, respects other people, and like respects freedom.
Thank you. And Sakich, did you find a question you wanted to answer to?
I thought I did, but it looks like I was looking at the document. I don't know if it got pulled off the document. So I'm not seeing it right now.
Okay.
I do see it in the chat though, and maybe I could address this one as long as I'm not misunderstanding. I'm seeing the question that says, doesn't the fact that consequences aren't evenly shared a reflection also of who has more material and economic assets to lose? And I think I seen it in the Google Doc, but then I went back and looked at it and I didn't see it pop up again. So now let me go ahead and look at it. I'm assuming what's being asked here is when we talk about consequences, and we're saying perhaps why settler activists aren't as engaged on the front lines is because they may have more to material and economically to lose. Is that what I'm kind of understanding it that way? And if that's the case, let me address it from that point of view. So maybe I'm misunderstanding the author who wrote this, but let me address it from that point of view. I mean, that's that question. We'd again have to look at the history. And that's what I'm saying. Knowing the history is so important for Canadians to say, well, we have more to material and economically lose. That's why you don't see us on the front lines so much. I would say that's a really tough position to take, because more than likely your material and economic gain is created from the conditions of colonialism in Canada, which are designed specifically to impose poverty and the policy of economic dependency on Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous people have less material and economic to lose because of colonial imposed poverty, as well as Canadians may have more material and economically because of the benefits of colonialism, right? And then I would posture against that the idea that this is problematic, because what we're saying is Indigenous life and liberty somehow is not as important as Canadian property, material and economic assets, right? So that, I think, needs to be taken into account. And that's why I'm saying, if we know the full history of colonization, we can see that it becomes harder to justify the material possessions that one may gain within a colonial state. Because one way or another, directly or indirectly, colonizers or settlers benefit from that system. So whatever material or economic assets you have, probably, and I'm not going to come out and say every single Canadian, but probably somehow in some way have been created because of this condition of colonialism, right? So yeah, I would say no, like the settler, the colonizer activist doesn't, in a moral sense, doesn't have more material and economic assets, because those were gained illegitimately by colonialism, at least the conditions that were set up by colonialism for them to gain those, right? So I'd say no, like the average settler activist still needs to be just as engaged, needs to be out in the front lines and willing to put their life and liberty up at risk, just like Indigenous people are doing. We may have material less, but somehow I don't feel my life or my liberty is worth less than Canadian materials or economic assets.
So thank you so much for both of you for giving you your time, giving us your time tonight, and also taking more time that was supposed to be. But sorry, I got too much in the conversation and I didn't see the time going, and I wanted to be able to hear everything you had to say. So if there's anything else you want to add, or if you want to close, because I don't just want you to leave you hanging like that. So if there's anything you want to add to end this, you're free to do so, both of you.
I would just say thanks for coming out. Thanks for staying and listening. I really love these opportunities to talk, and I think that even though sometimes maybe myself or maybe both of us could come across as like harsh or like taking a position that people aren't like doing enough or something, I think that like it's spoken out of not only like a love for the land and a love for our own people, but also like a love for like humans, and like the like desire to see us continue living here and like figure our shit out. So it's a tough kind of situation. Maybe that's all I'll say. Thanks, Marcy.
Thank you, JD.
I agree. I think right from the beginning, I had mentioned that I want to speak straightforward. And it's somewhat kind of bluntly, only because out of a sense of urgency, right? I hope, and I'm going to say this in a strange way, I hope I left those who are engaged on this platform in a dilemma. I want you to be in a personal dilemma. It could be a dilemma. It could be a moral dilemma. It could be an economic dilemma. It could be a political dilemma. What I want, or what I hope that I articulated, was an argument that's strong enough for you to start to question everything that makes up your current colonial reality. Right? So if you feel maybe a little bit angered by some of the positions that I have taken, or some of the words I've said, I'm hoping that that anger, that frustration, that irritation would kind of urge you or compel you to start looking at some of these issues, some of these facts, some of these histories a little bit deeper. So in a way, as much as Jaden is saying, it's a lot like tough love. I'm trying to poke you in that direction. And if I pose you a little bit in a dilemma that causes you to think about this more, then I'm hoping that's the case. And I hope you go the next step. Start learning about the history of colonization and what you could do to confront it, because it's that colonization that leads to our climate crisis.